And there you have it. President Cyril Ramaphosa has just concluded his State of the Nation address. In fact, his fifth State of the Nation address since 2018. And it's the first virtual State of the Nation address having been delivered since the history of South Africa. It's never been done as in the way it has been done before. In fact, the State of the Nation address this year having been scaled down quite a bit in terms of cost, in terms of attendance as well. Some parliamentarians not attending in the chambers of parliament and attending virtually instead. In fact, this very State of the Nation address has just cost just around 100,000 rand, which is a fraction of the cost that usually runs into millions. And it was delivered under the theme "Following Up on Our Commitments, Making Your Future Work Better." And tonight we are now going straight into analysis to find out what President Cyril Ramaphosa has just said to the nation and what it means for each one of us. We are now joined by analysts, a brilliant panel this evening. Firstly, we have Miyelani Mkhabela, who is a chief economist at Antswisa Transaction Advisory Services. Good evening, assalamu alaikum, and welcome to you. Miyelani Mkhabela.
Thanks, and listeners.
All right, and we are also joined by Ramokgopa, who is a political analyst and at Politricks, South Africa. Good evening to you and welcome to the show.
Good evening, and thank you for having me on your show.
We were also hoping to speak to Professor Gouws, who is a professor of political science at the University of Stellenbosch. She is running a bit late, and we hope to be joined by her in a few moments. But we'll begin right ahead with this discussion, and we'll start with you, Jimmy. So let's look back at SONA 2018, when President Cyril Ramaphosa delivered his first State of the Nation address. Amidst much hope and optimism, fast forward to today, we are grappling with a battered economy. We are in the middle of a pandemic. In fact, we are in a new normal as opposed to the new dawn that was widely spoken about back then. Speak to me about this, Jimmy.
Well, considering the circumstances, I think the president managed to bring some sort of hope and managed to have a bit of more content that would be able to enable a sense of confidence in the projection of the country. But like many other State of the Nation's addresses, there were promises that were made. It is, however, refreshing to see some of the promises which were made before being fulfilled or being updated in today's State of the Nation address, particularly the promise of establishing a smart city. That was something which was the highlight of his initial State of the Nation address, and seeing that coming into fruition and coming with a follow-up brings some level of confidence. Of course, as I said, the State of the Nation address comes during a difficult time in the country, and so it is very difficult for any president to impress any nation, and I think under the circumstances, President Cyril Ramaphosa managed to handle it much better than expected.
All right, so it seems that some of the promises which were made last year have been fulfilled. That's a great thing. But many more new promises also. It's some of the same things having been said once again when it comes to economic growth as well. Miyelani Mkhabela, do you think President Ramaphosa has met expectations?
I wouldn't think so. Precisely because, when you look on the State of the Nation's address for 2020, and then you look on the State of the Nation's address for 2021, one will probably say it is the same. The difference is 2 weeks before the State of the Nation's address on 2020, there was no COVID-19. And then now we are having COVID-19, of which the primary emphasis that have been taking place in South Africa is defeating COVID-19, and the critical aspects, which is to build a capable state, has been reduced to probably priority number 2, 3, and 4. And then the issue of health has been a priority number 1. And I don't think things must be in that way, I have a feeling that we need to look at what, one, a political party has to do, two, what is expected from the nation, because when you look on, it can be the European Union, through the European Central Bank or the ECB, how they have been doing things. They have plans in place, and by September last year, they had plans in place that can put European Union to recover in 18 to 22 months. But like when we listen to the State of the Nation's address, post all these COVID times that like we have experienced last year, South Africa hasn't come to a point to to evaluate and quantify on when will we recover as a country. So if that has not got to be, aligned on a project plan, you understand, it will be a problem, because it still seems like we are dealing with something that we don't understand, and we are dealing with a challenge that we really don't know when it's going to to end. So I think it's a very huge problem that technically, because we don't just speak, we don't speak in general. This is an economy. So we use technical analysis to evaluate, and we look at the indicators. And then from evaluating the challenge and the indicators, the country hasn't come to a point of evaluating the challenge, and then at the same time looking at when are we going to probably recover. And that is a very huge problem looking from investment point of view. While on the other hand, the problem that we have been experiencing emanating from the past 10 years, which is the State Capture Commission, we don't know when it's going to end. It is waiting to receive a budget next week in the budget speech, pronouncement. So that on its own, you can't really run corruption cases, demarketing the country for such a long time. We really need to close some of the projects that, I'm not saying that they are not necessary, but we need to have a way of starting a project and then we quickly complete them. We can't run state of, state capture for this long. It's becoming, more of the country is focusing on state capture. There's no country that can focus on state capture. The economy or the president is elected for economic growth and economic development and create jobs for the people. There's no person, who will be interested in looking on the state capture for this long while the country is not productive. So I think, it's about issues that they must prioritize critical things and put the issue of recovery as a primary issue. COVID-19 is just an external aspect that can affect each and everyone. We can't really focus on that as a primary issue as if we are not running an economy. So I think that is an issue in our priorities.
All right, thank you so much for that, Miyelani. And if you've just joined us, you are tuned into Salam Media. My name is Zahid Jared, and we are together for a few more moments as we delve into the analysis of President Cyril Ramaphosa's fifth State of the Nation address, which he's just delivered a few moments ago. And we are joined by quite a brilliant panel this evening. Miyelani Mkhabela, Ramokgopa, and Professor Amanda Gouws joined us now. In fact, she's just joined us. She's a professor of political sciences at Stellenbosch University. So, Professor Amanda, we've been speaking in the introduction to this discussion. I've heard from Jimmy and I've heard from Miyelani. So Jimmy's actually satisfied by some of the promises that were made last year, having been implemented since then. And although there were some promises which were not actually met, and those, of course, certain disappointment towards that. Miyelani spoke about the priorities of government, and he says there seems to be an issue with regards to government's priorities when it comes to prioritizing healthcare over the economic recovery. Just your thoughts in a nutshell before we begin delving into the specifics. What are your thoughts on President Ramaphosa's address? Did he meet expectations?
Yes, good evening. I thought it was a balanced State of the Nation address because it was focused on 4 priorities, which I think are the important ones. The pandemic, economic recovery, jobs, and so what I actually think was important is that he looked back at what was delivered and he also looked forward. And for me, speaking about, for example, the last priority was corruption. Is the new advisory council on corruption, the Fusion Center, and so on. And also speaking about gender-based violence, which is important to me, and I think important to all women and should be to all people in this country. How he is putting the money towards the National Strategic Plan and what should happen, how that money should be spent. Now, we know that in a State of the Nation address, it's very difficult to give the details. But I think what is important to South Africans tonight is also to know about details. And I think he was a bit low on the details when it came to the vaccine rollout. I think people want to know how it's going to be rolled out, how it's going to be monitored, so we don't have further corruption in relation to the pandemic. But at least we know that there is some priority set also with regards to local government to professionalize it more. And of course, we can say, some of it's only promises. But, he looked back and he showed that some of the stuff he's promised in the past has come to fruition. And I think this was a really difficult year for the president to do the State of the Nation in, because since his last State of the Nation until tonight, we've basically been in a lockdown, struggling with the pandemic and the fallout, economic fallout of that pandemic. And I think that, I am not so convinced by his take on the job creation situation, even though he's saying, we're actually doing well and we've created more jobs and we are actually going to have more jobs. That can only be said if we get to control this pandemic, and we're not there yet. And this is only going to be determined by what is happening with the rollout of the vaccine. And that, to me, he wasn't very clear on. And I think the last point I want to make is that we can have all the councils and all kinds of structures to deal with corruption, unless the ANC as a party comes to the party in the sense of dealing with corruption. It's going to be very difficult to deal with corruption. So it's not only about the president as the leader of the state, but it's also the leader of the party. And a huge lot or quite a substantial amount of the problems that he's dealing with is because of the division within the ruling party.
And I suppose we are dealing with quite a bit of uncertainty when it comes to the pandemic. And of course, when it comes to the economic recovery, also, we're going to have a better understanding of the direction in which the pandemic is going. And hopefully, once the vaccination program is rolled out, we can actually, consider, we can look forward to reopening the economy and rebuilding the economy. But there's a lot has been lost, despite the promises, that certain promises, as Jimmy mentioned earlier on, that were met. A lot has been lost, Jimmy. So if we look at just from an economic perspective, President Ramokgopa himself admitted that when he delivered the State of the Nation address last year, there was hardly any indication that of what would come in the future with regards to COVID-19. But he also admitted that there were 1.7 million fewer people employed in the third quarter of 2020 than there were in the first quarter before the pandemic struck. And then he also admitted that poverty is on the rise, inequality is deepening. So this seems to be a growing challenge for the president. And it's been one of the focal points of his State of the Nation addresses. For each one of the addresses that he's delivered, it's been the focal point. The economy has been one of the focal points of his addresses. So it seems to be a growing challenge for him, Jimmy.
Yes, indeed. Unemployment has been a serious concern in South Africa for quite a while. But what I do appreciate from the president's address this evening is that he recognized the important role of the private sector in job creation. Now, this is something that many, how can I put it, I'd say ANC or / socialist type of politicians would not advocate as much. But what we saw today was a president that admits that the private sector is actually a critical role in terms of reducing the unemployment rate in South Africa. Also noting a bit of the public sector and its role in terms of the development, and also most importantly in terms of creating an enabling environment for the private sector to be able to do what it's meant to do, which is to create jobs. Furthermore, apart from the enabling environment, what we saw from his address was the strategy of looking at the construction sector and seeing it as a viable option of job creation, skills development, and enterprise development. We see this from his initiatives in trying to create the smart city, as I've mentioned, but also opening up other construction projects that will enable the development not only of a country in terms of its capacity to accommodate economic development, but also as a country that's able to foster some medium of exchange of economic activity. So in other words, instead of putting 1 billion rand into an additional grant, rather take the 1 billion rand to develop a road or a bridge or a settlement. By doing so, not only are you creating employment, you are also developing the skills of people, and you are having a long-lasting piece of infrastructure which will enable, or rather encourage, more development and more investment into the country. So what I loved from his address particularly was his foresight in future-proofing the country, not only to deal with our immediate challenges, that is COVID-19, but to deal with future challenges of having an environment that's ready for investment from a local or an international investor.
And Miyelani, the president, also spoke quite extensively about boosting local production so that our reliance on importation is also reduced. And he also spoke about supporting local businesses. What's your take on this?
So, when you look on the responsibility, or like lockdown has hit, hit hard our manufacturing sector, and we really need to attend into that sector, growing it to make it a sector that the whole Africa can rely into. So when you look on the manufacturing sector, and then you look on agro-processing or agriculture and agro-processing, these are the two sectors that might need to be used to assist in the exports that, one, from the continent point of view, or from the project of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, we really need to use those two two sectors to to boost South African economic growth with taking advantage of the African market. But in terms of how that will be done, because you really can't do manufacturing and agro processing overnight. So some of the things, they will still take time, because we don't have these industries being developed now. And if we are going to do it, at least probably when, so it can be something that we can look at it to happen maybe from 2025, at times, because you can't really expect agro processing to happen overnight. You really need to come up with agriculture, and then you do agro processing. But on the other side, when you look on manufacturing sector, you really need to create these manufacturing hubs, whether it will be smart factories or smart industries that are needed to start like the activities. And such as well as we speak now, since such is not there, you understand, you will really need to look at 18 to 24 months to practically execute that. So because there is the construction period or the developmental like period in everything, of whether it's agriculture and whether it's agro processing or like manufacturing. So we are not really going to see change overnight, let's say in a period of 18 to 24 months. So we're going to look at a State of Nations address in 2024 that probably will start to say we will be starting to see a difference. But 2023, I'm telling you that we will be speaking much of the things while they are not yet developed, or we are not yet starting to see the job creation and the export from those industries. So and I'm really talking about project preparation when it comes to these types of initiatives, and I'm talking about the implementation of that project preparation and having those projects starting to be implemented and create jobs. It's not really something that has to like to be done like overnight. It's really a lot of aspects that will be needed. So sometimes we really need to look at what are the things that we can do in a short term, and then we really speak with with a Gantt chart. When we start speaking with a Gantt chart, and then we say in the next 6 months we will start to see job creation in tourism. If that can happen, tourism is easier to do that with tourism, but certain sectors is really not feasible to do that. And South Africa is dependent on investment. We are not really investing like you are Russia. Russia invests using their own money. But with South Africa, we need to go for a roadshow so that we can attract like investors. So there is, calculated like measures of how long will the roadshow take place, when will we close the roadshow, when will we start the manufacturing centers, and when will that operation of these smart factories and smart industries start to boom and create jobs. So practically, there are certain things that we can talk about it as like now I'm talking, but it's not going to happen overnight. And we really need to start to be practical like that as the South African government, because we have been talking for the past 20 years. Nothing is happening. The bulk of people that are unemployed is starting to be a crisis that we are not going to manage. When you have youth unemployment that is 60 to 70%, that scale, you are not going to manage it. And you are just speaking about an economy that is in the brink of like a collapse. The complexity that South Africa is facing is not something that this will be managed over a short term. And it's very good if they can start indicating that we are having challenges, we are having a crisis, we are unable to create jobs, so that as well, when they need assistance, people can as well come in. But when we close as if we are able to solve the problems, the problem continues and bulking of problems that are not being solved. We are going to reach 2024 while things are not solved. And that is the problem that we will face in South Africa, because we are not starting to talk the truth. And reality will hit on us in a very bad note.
And just briefly, Miyelani, before we move on, and in fact, we've got to begin wrapping up in a few moments, but briefly, as brief as possible, I just want to know from you, your opinion. Do you think what President Ramokgopa said this evening, especially when he came to what he said regarding investment, he mentioned a lot of achievements when it comes to investments in the automotive sector. And do you think this actually does it reflect the actual situation on the ground? Because he did mention quite a bit about investment from large companies such as Ford, Mercedes-Benz, Toyota as well. But just as quickly, NUMSA came out and said that they are currently fighting and defending for 250 jobs for their members because Mercedes-Benz demanded that they must shift production to Botswana, exploiting SACU and Africa Free Trade, despite the president presenting the sector as good. That's what Irvin Jim said from NUMSA, one of the trade unions. That was their response. Do you think what the president says actually reflects the situation on the ground?
The situation on the ground is terrible, as opposed to a lot of things that are being mentioned. And when you look, whether you are looking on French companies, you are looking at Canadian companies, you are looking at German companies, there is a point of these companies and multinationals, they are cutting more of non-corp because in their own countries, COVID is not happening in South Africa. It's happening in the global community. And these countries are affected in their own countries. And each and every country is trying to prioritize the little investments that they have for their own economies. And any economy outside their country, it's something that they can opt for as an additional aspect. There will be no investment that I will probably say will be just coming in that way. Investment will be focused inward in the countries because countries have been affected with COVID-19 in their own communities. So I don't really see the practicalities of what is being said as, companies will expand operations in our local market.
All right, thank you so much for that. And now if I could just move over to Professor Gouws with regards to some of what the president said when it comes to gender-based violence. So he spoke quite a bit about that as well. And he mentioned that Cabinet has approved a policy that 40% of public procurement should go to women, businesses owned by women. And he spoke also as well about the responsibility when it comes to fighting gender-based violence. What are your thoughts on this, Professor Gouws?
Well, thank you for that question, because I think if we just talk about job creation, there's very often, and also in tonight's Sona, the focus on entrepreneurs and enterprises. And very often those are not the jobs where you find women. So we need to think about how are we going to create jobs for women, specifically because in the sectors that were really hard hit by the pandemic, the entertainment sector, in relation to restaurants, the public health sector that's under huge pressure, all kinds of sectors where you find women, and also the tourism sector. So how are we going to actually make it more possible for women who've lost their jobs in those sectors to find jobs? And that's not very clear if we keep focusing on entrepreneurship and enterprises. So the announcement of 40% funding for women in the enterprise sector is, I think, very important and significant. But it's good to say we're putting the money towards that. What we need is to know how. And I think that's the important thing, is that how are we going to make sure that women actually can access this money? Very often it's got to do with skills, it's got to do with the necessary training and so on. So I'm very happy to hear that, but I also think that we need to make it possible for women to access the funding that will be made available.
Mm-hmm. And we'll just wrap up with the most important question. I believe it would be important that we do ask this question before I let you go. The main question. So I'll start with you, Jimmy, and then Miyelani, and finally Professor Gouws can answer that question as well. So here it goes. Are you confident that these promises made tonight will translate into implementation?
Well, judging from history, I do not think so. There are good promises, there are good ideas, but I don't think the ANC is a capable government of achieving it.
All right, thank you so much for that. Miyelani, Mkhabela, your final thoughts?
Implementation capacity is a problem in South Africa. And then we've been experiencing that. When you look on the past, I will just say maybe the past 5 to 7 state of the nation's address is provincial addresses. It's a lot of things that have been said. If you can go and consolidate such priorities, it's a lot, but nothing is happening on the ground. So they will continue to have problems, until they solve political stability in their own house. Up until that is solved, that is the only way. Priority for this country to turn around, it sits with political stability. Without political stability, the investors, no one will be interested in a country that doesn't have, a decisive focus and a proper passion and determination of helping society. And that will be the problem that we'll experience in South Africa.
All right, thank you for that as well. Professor Gouws, your final thoughts. Do you think this will result in implementation at grassroots levels?
Well, I think there's already a trust deficit with the population, the citizens, and it can only get better if the ANC do something about its own division. And that's the problem. It's divided and it hampers implementation. And I think the biggest fear that most citizens have is that the money put towards really good and valid goals will be squandered in corruption. And as long as the government cannot contain corruption, I don't have a lot of faith for the implementation.
All right, thank you so much for that. And just quickly before we end off here, a quick comment here from a Twitter user says, this year's SONA is going to cost around 100,000 Rand compared to an average of 2.5 million Rand over the last couple of years. Can we never go back to those unnecessarily expensive displays? Honestly, we need the money for far more important things. And I think those people last year who were campaigning for a cheaper State of the Nation address without all that fashion and that glamour and the red carpet events and all of that, I think those people have gotten their wish this year, and the State of the Nation address being scaled down, the costs having been scaled down quite a bit considerably. But then there's also the question of whether 100,000 Rand is justifiable for such a significant event, obviously, but with obviously being scaled down so much compared to previous years. But that's the debate that's going on around the country, and do keep the conversation going. The WhatsApp number for Salam Media is 061-766-0355. Tweet and tag @SalamMedia. Alternatively, you can be in touch with us via our YouTube and Facebook channels. But we keep the conversation going off air. Thank you so much to the contributors and panelists this evening for your analysis. Professor Amanda Gouws, Professor of Political Sciences at the University of Stellenbosch, Ramokgopa, Political Analyst at Politricks South Africa, Mkhabela, Chief Economist at Antswisa Transaction and Advisory Services. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And thanks to the listeners as well for tuning in this evening. Do stay tuned to Salam Media. But from myself, Zahid Jadid, and the team, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.